Let me first congratulate the university, the professor, and all the faculty members and staff for the excellent performance and achievements that I was just seeing from the University of Colombo. And also, when I just went through the volume of abstract of research, I was impressed with very diverse areas of disciplines that we have been able to generate, produce valuable research, and also your contributions to the global research, which is very important contribution from academia and for the help the global and local developments to make evidence-based policy making as well as evidence-based research is important aspect of especially from a top-ranked university. Let me again thank you and congratulate for the achievements. It has been great pleasure and honor for me to deliver the keynote speech at this important research symposium at your university, held under the theme of research excellence and beyond. I think very timely theme. I make this an opportunity to thank Professor already mentioned for inviting me to this occasion. Today, I would like to share my insight on the topic, which is much relevant to the central bank job that I am doing now, so that you heard where I come from. Since I joined the central bank, its topic is inflation, public enemy number one. So let me share why I say that and the reasons and evidence-based reasons on my topic. Inflation obviously is a topic that affects every aspect of our lives. You all know better than mine, looking at the cross-border protests going on as a result of inflation. It's a force that shapes our purchasing power, influences our financial decisions, and impacts the overall stability of our society. That's why we saw some social unrest last year because we saw inflation was rising, cost of living was so high, and people didn't have sufficient incomes to meet the rising inflation. In the year 2022, inflation accelerated to extraordinary levels globally, driven by lagged effects of ultra-easy monetary and fiscal support, mainly following the COVID-19 pandemic, supply shortages and capacity constraints, along with supply chain issues that was mainly with the COVID as a global issue. Affected by global as well as domestic factors, Sri Lanka also experienced even very high inflation at unprecedented levels in 2022. However, in late 2022, Sri Lanka entered an impressive disinflation path. If you can remember, it was 70%, and food inflation was 95%, almost 100%, double the level of prices that we had a year ago, which means 100% of food inflation. But eventually bringing down inflation to the down target levels within a period of 1 year. So after 12 months, now we are having inflation. Still, inflation means, as we all know, rising levels of prices, but still at a much lower rate of 1% now compared to 70% we had last year. Sri Lanka's swift disinflation process was supported by a combination of policy measures implemented by both the central bank and the government. In the next few minutes, I will delve into international experience and the academic outcomes on the causes and consequences of inflation, the role of monetary policy in coping with inflation, especially the role of central banks, the dynamics of Sri Lanka's high inflation episode, and the role of central bank Sri Lanka in managing inflation and inflation expectations, with special emphasis to the new Central Banking Act of Sri Lanka. A better understanding of the above could help shape academic research, which would also contribute towards effective policy making and business decisions. Why would I say inflation as a number one public enemy? Inflation, a fundamental concept in economics, refers to the sustained increase in general price levels of goods and services in an economy over a period of time. It's not one off, it's a sustained period of over a period of time. When inflation occurs, each unit of currency buys fewer goods and services than it did before, leading to a decrease in the purchasing power of money. Over the years, economists and policymakers emphasize the seriousness and negative impact of inflation on the economy and people's lives. High inflation episodes have been recurring phenomenon in economic history, causing significant challenges for nations and their citizens. It was in this context that Gerald Ford, the 38th President of the United States, even declared inflation as public enemy number one. In one of the President Ford's addresses to Congress in 1974, he stated, this was 1970, well, 1970 we had hyperinflation globally with petroleum prices in crisis. Only two of my predecessors, quote, only two of my predecessors have come in person to call upon Congress for a declaration of war, and I shall not do that. But I say to you with all sincerity that our inflation, our public enemy number one, will, unless whipped, destroy our country, our homes, our liberties, our property, and finally, our national pride, as surely as any well-armed wartime enemy. Unquote. So this is even enemy worse than a war. President Ford introduced the slogan, "Whip inflation now," which is called in shorter form, WIN, as part of his campaign to fight inflation, and even started wearing buttons with WIN. Although the outcome of this campaign is debatable, it illustrates how much of a problem inflation was in the 1970s, not only in Sri Lanka but globally. So let me just share some of the other historical episodes of high inflation. Indeed, many countries have grappled with high inflation, and in some cases hyperinflation, what we call inflation going to go up over 100 and then going up to thousands, then we call hyperinflation. So fortunately, we didn't have that experience. We were able to contain it after below 700%. One of the most infamous cases of hyperinflation occurred in Germany during early 1920s. Following World War I, Germany experienced a severe economic crisis exacerbated by the repression imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. The German government printed an excessive amount of money to meet its obligations after the end of the war, leading to hyperinflation. Prices skyrocketed and people's saving became worthless. At its peak, prices were doubling every few days, and workers were paid multiple times a day. That was the situation in Germany just after the end of the war in 1920s. At its peak, prices were double. Then another example, Zimbabwe in the late 2000s faced hyperinflation due to a combination of economic mismanagement, land reforms, and political instability. The government printed money recklessly, causing prices to soar at an astronomical rate. At its peak in mid-November 2008, not too fast, not too in the recent history, Zimbabwe's hyperinflation reached an astounding monthly rate of, I was talking about annual inflation, this is monthly rate of around 500 billion%. This quote by Moy 2023, the latest paper. The Zimbabwean dollar became practically worthless, and the country abandoned its own currency, relying on foreign currencies for transactions. Similarly, countries such as Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela experienced hyperinflation crisis from time to time since 1980s. So we are seeing the repercussions of this hyperinflation on those countries and still struggling to recover from these hyperinflation episodes. Why hyperinflation or high inflation? Even hyperinflation is worse, but even high inflation is bad. Inflation represents how much more expensive the relevant set of goods or services has become over a certain period, most commonly a year. When you talk about inflation, we call inflation, increased price over a period of 1 year. To that extent that households' nominal income does not increase as much as prices. That we all know, that's why the academics are asking for higher salaries because your inflation has gone up, labor price gone up, but prices, incomes have not gone up to same extent. In other words, households' purchasing power or real income, inflation adjusted income, falls. Real income is a proxy for the standard of living, and real incomes are rising, so is the standard of living, and vice versa. I don't want to dwell on this more because we had this experience last year, and already some of the coders are experiencing this. Savers and investors suffer significant losses during the period of high inflation. It's not only the cost of living that erodes the value of your savings. It will become worthless of the savings that you are having in terms of the rupees. The real value of savings diminishes rapidly, while investors experience a decline in the real returns of their investments. Moreover, high inflation breeds uncertainty in the economy. Businesses face difficulties in planning for the future, unsure of their future costs and revenues. This uncertainty leads to reduced investments and hampers economic growth. Furthermore, nations experiencing high inflation find their international competitiveness severely compromised. As domestic prices rise, cost of exports increases, making products less competitive in the global market. The situation can lead to a trade imbalances that we have seen already and hinder economic recovery efforts, further exacerbating the challenges posed by high inflation. Although high inflation hurts an economy, deflation, on the other hand, what they call steady decline of prices or falling prices, is not desirable either. When prices are falling, consumers delay making purchases if they can anticipate any low prices in the future. If price levels are coming down, which means people who consume today, who make investment today, who delay their decision, that will have impact on their own economies. For the economy, this means less economic activity, less income generated by producers, low economic growth. As you may know, Japan is one country with a long period of nearly no economic growth, largely because of this deflation. Given the above, most economists now believe that low and stable inflation, and most importantly, predictable inflation, is good for an economy. What I am saying here is not the high inflation. Low and stable economy is needed for economic growth. If the inflation is low and predictable, it is easier to capture it in price adjustment contracts and interest rates, reducing its distortionary impact. Then let me just share what causes inflation. Inflation could be influenced by numerous factors. Understanding these diverse causes of inflation is essential for academics as well as policymakers to recommend and implement appropriate measures to maintain stable prices and support economic growth. Demandful inflation occurs when the demand for goods and services exceeds their supply. That's what we call money supply exceeds the demand. When the demand outstrips supply, business often raises prices to maximize their profits. Cost push inflation occurs when the cost to produce goods and services increases, leading businesses to pass the additional cost onto consumers in the form of higher prices. This can be caused by rising wages, increased cost of raw materials, or other production-related expenses. Expectations also play a key role in determining inflation. That's a very important one, is the expectation channel. If people or firms anticipate higher prices or high inflation, they build this expectation into wage negotiations and contractual price adjustments. So it's important inflation is stable and that factor into all the economic decisions. To the extent that people base their expectations on the recent past, what they call adaptive expectations, inflation would follow similar patterns over time, resulting what we call inflation inertia. That when you have long period of high inflation, that will feed into inflation expectations. In the long run, inflation is primarily caused by factors related to the overall increase in the money supply. This is our important factor, is the money supply. Money has a lot of things to do with inflation in an economy related to growth in real output of goods and services. If the money supply grows too big relative to the size of an economy, the unit value of the currency diminishes. In other words, its purchasing power falls and prices rise. That's what we have seen even in Sri Lanka in the recent past. Milton Friedman, a Nobel laureate in economics, argued that, quote, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, unquote. Friedman argued that changes in money supply, driven by central bank policies and other monetary factors, are the primary drivers of inflation in the long run, while other factors can cause short term fluctuations in prices. While Friedman's insight into the monetary roots of inflation remains a fundamental principle, economists and policymakers now consider a broader array of factors when analyzing inflation trends. Modern economic analysis incorporates a more holistic approach, recognizing the interplay of various elements in shaping inflationary outcomes. How the next part I talk about how policymakers deal with inflation and the role of monetary policy, so that we know money has to play a big role in determining inflation. Then how the policymakers can manage that situation. The policies aimed at reducing inflation depend to a great extent on the causes of inflation. If the economy has overheated and inflation is primarily demand driven, central banks can implement contractionary monetary policy that rein in aggregate demand. Indeed, the central banks play a crucial role in controlling inflation through monetary policy. This is where all over the world, the key responsibility of any country, monetary authority, is the price stability objective. Similarly, one of the primary objectives of monetary policy, as emphasized by many central banks around the world, is, as I said, maintain price stability. Price stability, which is measured by low and stable inflation, is crucial for a healthy economy as it ensures that the purchasing power of a currency remains relatively constant over time. Economists have argued that stable prices create a favorable environment for long-term economic growth and investments. I quote Mishkin to 2007, the work that he has done. Moreover, monetary policy also plays a role in promoting economic growth. Studies by Romer in his paper 1993 and Barrow and Salai Martin in 2004 suggest that stable monetary policies are positively correlated with long-term economic growth. So that's very strong evidence. Central banks use a range of tools to influence the money supply and interest rates affecting inflation. Traditional tools for some central banks we have been doing even in the past include policy interest rates, open market operations, and reserve requirements. Following the 2008 financial crisis, central banks implemented unconventional monetary policies such as forward guidance, quantitative easing, asset purchasing, and negative interest rates. Furthermore, central bankers are increasingly relying on their ability to influence inflation expectations as an inflation reduction tool. Policymakers announced their intention to keep economic activity low temporarily to bring down inflation, hoping to influence expectations. The more credibility central banks have, the greater the influence of their pronouncement on inflation expectations. That's why central bank credibility is the key to anchor inflation expectation. Otherwise, what we say, people, if you don't believe, there's no anchoring inflation expectations. However, monetary policy is faced with increasing challenges and trade-offs. For example, what we call famous the Phillips curve, the theory held by Phillips, the Phillips curve, which describes the inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment or output, has been the subject of extensive research. Studies that integrate monetary policy, inflation, and output stabilization have provided insights into trade-offs faced by policymakers. I can quote several papers, Clarida, Gall, and Gertler in 1999. This is a very landmark research when achieving price stability. Furthermore, with increased globalization, international factors can have a heightened impact on domestic inflation, as raised by Obstfeld and Rogoff in 2002. This shed light on complexities of maintaining price stability in a globalized world. Across the globe, monetary policy frameworks cover various approaches. It's not that there's no unique monetary policy approach to address inflation. approaches, strategies, and models employed by central banks to achieve their objectives, such as price stability. Among those approaches and strategies, inflation targeting has been a widely adopted monetary policy framework since the 1990s. Sure, New Zealand is one of the pioneers of inflation targeting. And obviously, we had some assistance from courtesy of High Commission here. Got some experts from the former central bankers to share the experiences. Under inflation targeting, central banks set explicit inflation targets and use policy instruments to achieve them. Studies show that countries adopting inflation targeting are benefited in terms of providing clear objectives to the stakeholders and enhance transparency. This is evidence-based research by Bernanke, former Federal Reserve Bank chair, Tobash, Mishkin, and Posen in 1999 paper. Many central banks have moved toward flexible inflation targeting, a special case of inflation targeting, which allows temporary deviation from the target to accommodate shocks to the real economy. Flexible inflation targeting has its advantage in terms of stabilizing both inflation and the real economy. This evidence in Symposium 2010, former deputy governor of the European Central Bank. Then just share with some recent episodes of global inflation. We are always talking about the very high interest rates in globally major central banks and as a result of global inflation. Despite the advances in monetary policy frameworks across the globe, inflation accelerated to unprecedented levels during the year 2022 in other countries, as advanced countries especially. According to the IMF, global inflation accelerated to 8.7% in 2022. Usually we are seeing 0 2% inflation, but all of a sudden went up to 8.7% from global average of 4.7% the previous year. Within the year, double the rate of inflation, reflecting the impact of lagged effects of ultra-easy monetary and fiscal support following the COVID-19 pandemic, shortages of fuel and non-fuel commodities exacerbated by the Russian-Ukraine conflict, and capacity constraints around the supply chain issues due to COVID-19 restrictions. Many countries allowed the pass-through of high global prices to the domestic economy as administrative price settings measures that are not cost-reflective usually result in the government's accrual of large subsidy bills that we have also experienced to compensate producers for their lost income. However, in the light of substantial monetary tightening by major central banks in the world, the resultant slowing of economic activity, easing supply chain disruptions, and moderating prices of energy and other commodities, inflation started to moderate recently in 2023. Nonetheless, the forecast level of inflation in 2023 and even 2024 are still higher than pre-pandemic levels of around 3.5%. This is the challenge that all global central banks are having. Once it's gone up, it's difficult to bring it down in a short period of time. Moreover, the underlying price pressures are proving sticky with labor markets tight in several economies. Therefore, what we call co-inflation, which is what we call underlying inflation, is likely to decline more slowly in the period ahead. Further, with rising geopolitical tensions is another factor in the Middle East, upside risk to global inflation if that has wide implications on the energy prices. So let me just share with you the Sri Lanka's economic crisis and rising inflation that is familiar story. In 2022, Sri Lanka experienced its worst ever economic crisis, a crisis that was in the making for many years, triggered by policy errors and exacerbated by other exogenous factors. Failure to build fiscal and external buffers over time made the nation vulnerable to domestic and external shocks, and the COVID-19 pandemic and the related shocks unearthed the vulnerabilities in Sri Lankan economy, bringing about the worst economic crisis in Sri Lankan history. The resultant economic hardships led to both public anxiety and political upheaval. By early 2022, the economy faced severe challenges due to an unsustainable macroeconomic model, along with the persistent budget deficits and external current account imbalances. These issues, influenced by global and domestic factors, had depleted the economy's foreign exchange reserves. As a result, the country experienced intense pressure on its balance of payments, leading to a shortage of foreign exchange a weakened exchange rate, soaring inflation, as we already discussed, and reduced economic activity and contracting economy. Although Sri Lanka managed to have single-digit inflation prior to the crisis, we were able to manage single-digit inflation over 4 or 12 years since 2009. Inflation rose to historical high levels during the crisis in 2022, stemming from global oil and all the reasons that I already explained. And contrary to the co-momentum in inflation and economic growth in regular business cycles, Sri Lanka witnessed inflation and economic growth moving in opposite direction. Inflation was increasing at 70%, while economy is contracting at 8%. Is completely opposite direction as supply as well as demand-driven inflation accelerated over inflation and economic growth stalled. This is the experience that we are seeing in a lot of other hyperinflation countries for a long period of economic stagnation and high inflation, making people unable to, and living standards falling sharply and more poverty in those countries. What are the measures that were taken to overcome this sharp rise in inflation? Several policy measures have been taken by the central bank to stabilize the economy and tighten monetary and credit conditions with a view to countering rising inflation pressures and anchoring inflation expectations. The central bank tightened monetary policy significantly, starting from gradually in August 2021 and with a significant increase in policy rates in April 2022. Monetary policy had to be conducted with an unprecedented level of deliberations as the country entered a phase of high inflation with the threat of hyperinflation and economic stagnation. And tightening of monetary conditions will not only result in a reduction in inflation but also economic growth. In parallel, central bank also implemented a series of policy measures aimed at maintaining external sector stability and building up reserves and reducing import demand. Since the beginning of monetary tightening cycle in August 2021, the central bank's key policy interest rates, what we call standing deposit and lending facilities, raised by 11 percentage points, the historically highest increase in central bank policy rates within a short period, especially in April. Furthermore, during this tightening phase, the central bank increased what we call statutory reserve ratio (SRR) by 2 percentage points, while several caps also were imposed on interest rates, and those are now removed and allowing for greater upward adjustment in market interest rates during the tightening cycle. The unprecedented upward adjustment of policy interest rates helped arrest further build-up of demand-driven inflation pressures, thereby preempting the escalation of adverse inflation expectations, easing the pressure on the external sector, and correcting anomalies observed in the market interest rate structure. That was the first painful policy measure that we had to take. Although painful, this was the only way out to address the situation that we had. Then disinflation process. Result of those tight policies, outcome of the policy efforts discussed above have eventuated since late 2022. Sri Lanka's inflation started moderating from its peak around 70%, as mentioned earlier, is now around almost 1% after 12 months period. I don't want to show a lot of numbers here. In terms of economic factors, this process was supported by subdued aggregate demand conditions due to tight monetary and fiscal policies, improvements in domestic supply conditions, improving external sector performance in terms of foreign reserves, and some normalization of global commodity prices, and the pass-through of such reduction in domestic prices and recovering economic activities gradually. So statistically, the disinflation process was influenced by both the momentum effect and the base effect. As you say, when you have very high inflation, and there's a base effect also playing a role, and also momentum effect with high contribution from the latter. For the medium term, following the rapid disinflation thus far in 2023, inflation is expected to stabilize at the targeted level of what we call 5% is the right level of inflation for Sri Lanka. As I said earlier, we need some stable, low and stable inflation, not disinflation, to support the growth. They should be supported by appropriate monetary policy measures along with improving supply conditions. Moreover, Sri Lanka's disinflation process is expected to turn around from September 2023 with the dissipating impact of favorable base. Therefore, the average 1% is an aberration, it's an adjustment, but it will settle somewhere around 5% in the medium to long term. Let me just finally to share with about the the monetary policy framework and new central banking act that we have been able to bring in as part of the reforms that we have implemented in the recent past. The legislative framework introduced by the Central Bank of Sri Lanka Act number 16 of 2023, what they call earlier Monetary Law Act, now we have a new act called New Central Banking Act, would reinforce price stability in the period ahead while ensuring that inflation expectations remain well anchored. The new Central Bank Act gives prominence to price stability by stating the primary objective of the Central Bank is now to achieve domestic price stability, which means low and stable inflation. In pursuing this primary objective, Central Bank shall take into account entirely the stabilization of output. It's not only inflation, but take into account stabilization of output towards its potential level. The other objective of Central Bank shall be to secure financial system stability. That's the second objective, to maintain stable banking and financial system. Under the Central Bank Act, there shall be a monetary policy board of the Central Bank. I'm glad to note that one of the members from your university, Professor Dunu Singh, is now a member of the Monetary Policy Board, which is charged with the formulation of monetary policy and implementation of flexible exchange rate regime in line with flexible inflation targeting framework in order to achieve and maintain domestic price stability. The creation of a separate decision-making body in addition to the governing board, which is the main board of the central bank, this monetary policy has a separate board now, signifies the importance placed on independent monetary policy making to achieving domestic price stability by this new legislation. Also, the Central Bank Act formally recognizes flexible inflation targeting, as I mentioned earlier, is a more successful inflation targeting monetary policy framework. As a monetary policy framework and requires the signing of a monetary policy framework agreement, setting out the inflation target to be achieved by the central bank. We have to sign an agreement between the Ministry of Finance and Central Bank on the level of inflation that we have to achieve. Accordingly, the Central Bank entered into an agreement with the Ministry of Finance in October 2023, the last month, where it was stated that the Central Bank shall aim to maintain quarterly headline inflation rate at a target of 5%, with a margin of plus or minus 2% for a period of time, in the medium to long term. If the Central Bank fails to, there's also accountability provisions, very strong accountability provision in the new law. Independent does not mean that we are not accountable. Central Bank fails to meet the inflation target by the margin determined in the agreement for 2 consecutive quarters, the Monetary Policy Board shall submit a report to the Parliament through the Minister, which shall also be made available to the public, accountable to the public and the markets, setting out the reasons for the failure to achieve the inflation targets and an estimate of the time period within which inflation targets shall be achieved and the measures also. These provisions, along with enhanced transparency and accountability, would ensure that inflation in Sri Lanka would be maintained at low and stable levels in the period ahead, thereby benefiting all stakeholders in the economy. As I mentioned earlier, that's why inflation is a public enemy number one. That's why we have these all strong provisions to independent central bank to deliver its objectives in a much more prudent manner. In conclusion, headwinds due to consecutive economic shocks in recent years have severely affected Sri Lanka's economic activity in 2022 and early 2023 this year, inflicting hardships on individuals and businesses. The government and the central bank implemented painful but unavoidable policy measures aimed at restoring macroeconomic stability, which is a priority, which was priority at the time. The near-term economic stabilization measures implemented thus far are unprecedented in the history of Sri Lanka and started delivering the expected positive outcomes as we now maintaining some stability. Inflation declined, as I mentioned already, sharply, little over 1% by September 23, and is expected to hover around the targeted level for the medium term. And similarly, because we are in a balance of payment crisis, external sector performance and foreign exchange performance is also important. It's improved so far, and exchange rate appreciated in 2023. The program with the IMF that we have presented is progressing, and stability of the financial sector has also been preserved amidst numerous challenges. There are a lot of concerns on the financial system stability, banking sector. They have been able to maintain stability there. Monetary policy will remain focused on ensuring price stability over the medium term, while giving due regard to the stabilizing economic growth towards its potential, under what we call flexible inflation targeting policy framework in implementing monetary policy. Going forward, the conduct of monetary policy will continue to be based on a forward-looking, data-driven, and evidence-based approach, supported by recent and expected macroeconomic developments and predictions, and also very good research. Both the timely adjustments to policies and strategies of the central bank will be made under the flexible inflation target framework as and when new information becomes available. Maintenance of inflation at a low and stable level would eliminate large swings in interest rates, thus creating an enabling environment for business. These are evidence-based policy making is quite important. We also have annual research conference like what we have here, mainly focusing on central bank objectives like monetary policy, financial stability. We had one recently, international research conference focusing, inviting a lot of research all around the world. I think I'm sure President Singh was also part of that, participated. The Central Bank of Sri Lanka Act would allow more independence to the central bank, limiting monetary financing and thereby strengthening policy targeted at maintaining inflation and inflation expectations. The primary object of the central bank being the maintenance of domestic price stability, the new act will serve as key buffer for the Sri Lankan economy against inflation. Moreover, the central bank remains committed to maintaining headline inflation at the targeted levels, thereby tackling inflation, public enemy number one, transparently and proactively. So let me wish, with that I conclude my speech today. And I would like to appreciate the efforts of the University of Colombo to strive for research excellence in a lot of areas. I would encourage you to also engage in practical research and evidence-based research, even more in economic areas, monetary policies, system stability areas as well. I wish the best of luck to all participants of Annual Research Symposium 2023. I hope that symposium will serve as a platform to demonstrate the university's cohesive approach to research excellence, transcending conventional boundaries to participate in socially and practically significant research aligned with various research domains. Thank you very much.